So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my partner on this project, Denise Kelsey. She's a scientist from our fish science group. Without this work, it would have been very difficult to accomplish this task. This is work that was funded in 2022 by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Invasive Species Grant process that Robert is in charge of, who spoke earlier this morning. I'd like to thank the Bureau of Indian Affairs again for that money. It's been invaluable getting out on the river. And we also received funding in 2023, which we'll be using this year. So why is CritFic monitoring for northern pike in the lower Columbia River? And I mean lower, I'm talking about downstream of Priest Rapids Dam. For those of you who are not aware, northern pike can become established in the upper Columbia River, upstream of Grand Coulee Dam, and also in the Pend Oreille and other drainages that feed into the Lake Roosevelt or the reservoir behind Grand Coulee Dam. There's a lot of dams between the lower Columbia River and Grand Coulee. But Grand Coulee does spill water over the top, which would carry pike over the top and not through turbines, where they would more likely survive. They have captured northern pike within, I think, 10 miles or less of Grand Coulee Dam itself. So they are in the proximity of that area. And again, because of northern pike's reputation and track record, it's something we certainly don't want down in the lower Columbia River, potentially going to impact anadromous fish runs. So another couple of reasons why we are in this situation of looking for northern pike where there may not be any is the fact that in 2021, there were two separate reports of pike or pike-like fish being caught or seen. First was a dried pike-like fish up here in the upper right corner on that pinkish red background. And that fish contained pike DNA, but it was unclear if it was a pike or a tiger muskie, which is a pike musculin muskie hybrid, which is a type of fish that is found in adjacent waters with northern pike back in the Midwest. And a tribal fisherman in the fall of that year, in September, believes he caught a pike on his scaffold at night, killed it, and then went back to bed because it was middle of the night fishing, and he went out in the morning and it was gone. But he says it looks exactly like the wanted posters that we have posted in fishing sites all up and down the Columbia River. So we're taking that as a positive sighting, although it's suspect in the sense we don't have the body. So, and that combined with enormous amounts of favorable pike habitat from Bonneville all the way up to Priest Rapids, that was the kind of the linchpin for putting this proposal together and fortunately receiving the funding. Northern pike native habitat is in the kind of yellowish butterscotch color in the Midwest part of the country. With the exception of Montana, there's a little tiny speck right there. I believe that's the Saskatchewan River that kind of loops through Montana, and that has northern pike, native northern pike populations as well. Everything in dark maroon is where pike have been established, legally or illegally. In most cases, many cases, they've been stocked historically by fish and game agencies as looking for an alternate game fish species. But more recently, these fish have been introduced either illegally or following the drainage systems that they originally introduced in. So the need for northern pike monitoring, as I mentioned earlier, we formulated a monitoring strategy back in 2022. We applied for and received the grant monies in 2022 and 23, and we've also applied for grant money this year in 2024 to continue this work. In addition, we were able to receive an additional grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service from their small grant packages, is what it's called. And that allowed us to work in national wildlife refuges in the John Day and McNary reservoirs, collecting more samples in conjunction with our regular BIA sampling. But it allowed us to focus the money on the sampling and the analysis of those samples. So we were able to spread our BIA monies out further. And we selected the Bonneville to Priest Rapids reach specifically because there was no current active monitoring program going on downstream. The reservoirs upstream of Priest Rapids are are managed by several public utility districts, and they are surveying for northern pike in those reaches, also utilizing eDNA. The other aspect of this is we focused on spawning and rearing habitat, utilizing GIS, aerial images, and previous habitat surveys that had been done by other agencies in the past. And we're really focusing on areas where pike, if they came down there, would seek out to spawn in the springtime. Pike utilize quiet, calm backwater areas, often with vegetation that's partially submerged, and they'll spawn in just a few inches of water if that habitat is favorable for them to spawn. So, and therefore it would also concentrate our eDNA work and more likely to find those critters. So when Denise and I did our first pass, we basically just looked at the water bodies themselves, and we ended up with a lot of sites. So I think the total was well over 150 locations that had watered backwater areas. We went through those and utilized a screening process, and we picked the top 50 plus. That doesn't mean we wouldn't go back and survey the other sites, but we really focused on sites that had the water, the permanency of water. They weren't dried out half the year. They had protected areas, they had submerged vegetation, and the water quality was something that would support fish life throughout the year. With the eDNA itself, we also had accompanying physical data and environmental data, water chemistry, that went along with our sites. This is a view of the Willow Creek area, which is a backwater of the Willow Creek drainage that flows north into the Columbia River near the town of Arlington, Oregon. Tremendous big bay back in there as we're looking straight north. Lots of invasive Phragmites in this area, which was, as it falls in the water, would be great habitat for pike to spawn on. And it's already a mecca for non-native fishes. There's a lot of carp and other non-native fish in this area, so there's a lot of forage for young pike. So in addition to the environmental eDNA collection, we documented our habitat depth, water clarity, chemistry, and the physical parameters of the site, the substrate, presence of native and non-native aquatic plants. And we also want to do a lot more gillnet sampling, but at this point in time last fall, we were really focused on collecting as much eDNA as possible. We weren't able to get into the water until last summer. So time was somewhat of the essence, but we were able to accomplish some gillnet work in the wildlife refuges last fall because we had access to these areas via airboat. So a little bit about the environmental eDNA samples. All of our sampling was done with an item device called a citizen sampler that was created and is sold by the Smith Root Company. And we have two kinds of filters. We have a sealed version that we utilize from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife genomics lab. And we also have an open removable filter strategy that is utilized by the USDA genomics lab. We actually have contract with both labs. Samples collected utilizing the USDA sampling, we were able to get, because it was federal money to a federal lab, we were able to spread our dollars out because we didn't have any indirect charge on that contract. So it was straight pass-through money. Although we did like the sealed versions of the WFW lab better because it was kind of a connected. We didn't have to worry about any cross-contamination with water falling in on top. It was just an easier process to work all the way around. And this sampler is designed to, most of our samplers were designed to, or sample media was designed to filter at least up to 5 liters of water across the filter membrane. In some cases, that was quite easy to do. In other cases, as you can see in the bottom left photograph, if there's a tremendous amount of suspended algae or plankton sediments, we often were only able to collect less than 2 liters of water across the filter before it was plugged, and we could no longer utilize it. The actual device, the filtering machine, the citizen sampler, could filter 2 liters of water at a time before we'd have to empty it and hook it back together and continue sampling. But it worked really well, flawlessly. We had no problems with it at all. We kept backup batteries, and it worked. It was very portable. It's got a little handle here. You just pack it up and carry it a lot of our sites were not accessible by, a boat dock or a ramp. We would have to hike into part of the areas through the brush and in the brambles to get to the water. And in some cases, we'd have to wade out into the water because the shoreline was too shallow, or plugged with material such as this in the bottom left corner. So we'd have to get out to clearer water. And a key part of this sampling process utilizing eDNA is that you would have to collect control samples from tap water that we brought in the field with us. And then you would have to decontaminate the sampler between sites. If you didn't do that, and you say you collected samples from 4 different sites, but one of them was a positive site, then you end up contaminating all 4 of your samplers, most likely, more samples. Therefore, you would have to go back to all 4 of those locations because you weren't sure which one was the actual positive sample. So we had utilized the cleaning protocols that were provided to us by the labs. And so we would go through and clean our device, and then we would take a control and we would clean it again before we went back out in the field. And this process, the efficacy of this process was verified in the fall utilizing a spiked positive sample with northern pike eDNA. It was a piece of fin tissue swirled around in water. And we had control samples on each side of it with the cleaning protocol in place. And when it came back from the lab at WFW, we had a positive hit on our spike sample, but the controls on each side of that sample were negative. So it definitely confirmed our decon process. In retrospect, that would have been something we would have done early on, but we did verify it and we were all good. So circling back to our physical habitat parameters, we collected substrate, macrophyte types in abundance. And the abundance was low, medium, high. It wasn't something that we measured specifically the number of stems or anything like that. We also took water velocities to establish flow. A lot of these locations had a culvert in which water would flow in and flow out. And depending upon the operation of the project, that reservoir at the time, if they were running water through the turbines at a higher rate or spilling water for fish passage, those ponds would drain a little bit, almost like a tidal influence. So in a perfect world, we would get samples as the water came in or came out, depending upon the location. So that's why we would record water flow and direction. And we would also then document shoreline vegetation, particularly if it was actually laying in the water, because then that would create habitat for pike to utilize in spawning time. Water chemistry was limited to 3 parameters. We looked at temperature, pH, and dissolved oxygen, the basic elements of fish life. We did not go into anything further than that. This is our tailgate lab where we would do a lot of our cleaning and decontamination processes before the next site. The large blue jug is our control water, our tap water. We carried a couple of these so that we had control waters to take our control sample. Some of these areas there was no water, as far as a tap water type source that did not contain DNA. So we carried it with us to make things easier. There's a lot of learning the first couple of weeks on this, but by the fall, Denise and I had this down to a process that worked very well. A little background on our 2023 field season. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't actually get out in the field until August. We received our money about in the spring of 2022. The first 6 months of that, we did a lot of work. Primarily Denise and I did a lot of work on, selecting the sites, doing the overview work from the desktop lab as far as, getting a handle on surface area, any past surveys, whether it was a permanent water site. And during that time period, in the back half of 22 and in early 23, we were refining and putting together our top 50 list. And then we had contracts to put together for our sampling labs. So we didn't get out until August of last year, and then sampled through early November. Obviously, it was a wide swing in habitat parameters. Air temperatures when we started were in the hundreds. by the time we wrapped up in the fall, it was down in the low 40s, and we were definitely fast approaching the wintertime conditions. Of the sites we had selected, some of them were not sampled because of low water, or you couldn't get into them. You know, it was a mud flat and the water was 50 yards away and there was literally no way to get there. Or a lot of these sites had excess suspended materials that, like the picture I showed earlier, there's full of green slime basically that would have fouled the filter within a liter or less of water. And some of these sites actually looked like they were, not fish-bearing waters upon physical inspection. And sampling was done from a variety of locations. As I mentioned earlier, shorelines, some of which were steep and rocky, other places it was nice and easy with a boat ramp or a dock. And then we also utilized an airboat exclusively for the Fish and Wildlife Refuge sites, which was incredibly handy. I've never utilized an airboat in my field work before, but they could literally slither across wet mud. So we were able to get into a lot of key areas on the refuge sites, backwater sloughs and areas where you couldn't have taken a boat, with the exception of maybe a kayak. But we were able to zip back and forth across the river and utilize that craft to get into a lot of good-looking pikey type habitat. And we ended up on the Hanford Reach in the Columbia in early November of 2023. So our survey results, we sampled 34 sites, excluding our refuge sites. That was an additional 16. Of all of our locations, we did not detect northern pike DNA. They were all negative. And we did set gill nets in the refuge sites at 7 different locations. And all we caught were non-native fish, mainly yellow perch, caught a walleye in a couple locations. But it kind of gave us an idea how the stuff would work. In a perfect world, we would do overnight gill net sets. But within the refuge, there was concerns. By this time, there was a lot of waterfowl moving in, and there was concerns about trapping non-target species. We're hoping to get out and do a little bit more work this spring with gill nets as the waterfowl have all left, and we have a little bit more flexibility in utilizing gill nets. Similar to Joey's word cloud earlier, we also constructed a word cloud relative to really focusing on the plant species. A lot of pike habitat really is based upon either emergent or submerged aquatic vegetation. And it wasn't surprising that milfoil species, most likely Eurasian milfoil, we didn't key them all out, was one of our most common. But what's surprising is leafy pondweed, which is actually a native macrophyte, was very close in abundance. And in some places was much more abundant than milfoil. But the static or stable water conditions in these reservoirs, and particularly these backwater areas, provided the leafy pondweed an opportunity to really proliferate and create a lot of habitat. And we found some native plants as well, sago pondweed, cattails, but a lot of invasive stuff too, canary grass, elodea. So just a pretty good mix of stuff that was found in these sampling sites. The water chemistry data, there wasn't anything really surprising, high DO levels in the summer, but definitely starting to taper off through August into September. And then they kind of peaked back up in the fall with cold, windy conditions and lots of turnover in these small areas. The DO generally, with the exception of a few areas where it was down around 5, wasn't a limiting factor in our locations. Temperatures took a natural projection from very high in August upwards of 25 C, obviously at least for salmonids, but not for pike and other warm water fishes. And by the time we reached November sampling, our temperatures were down in the single digits, which you'd expect in these shallow water bodies and that time of year. So observations, as I mentioned earlier, the thing that was most frightening to me actually was the abundance of habitat out there within our sites, both within the sample locations, which are not the main stem channel, but particularly in moving back and forth across the McNary Pool and also the John Day Reservoir with respect to the sampling of the locations within the Fish and Wildlife Refuge sites. There was a tremendous amount of main stem habitat for northern pike. Again, the stable conditions in a reservoir, unlike a free-flowing river, allow for these plants to become established. They slow the water down, which drops silt out of suspension. And it's kind of this positive feedback loop for more plants to be created over time. And in some locations, almost the entire width of the river, with the exception of the navigation channel, had standing and submerged aquatic vegetation, which would provide habitat for pike in the main stem Columbia River directly. We also found a non-native species. This is what's called a Chinese mystery snail that was documented in a new location near McNary Dam. And so even though we were focusing on just collecting observations for pike habitat, we were also keeping an eye out for other unusual, potentially invasive animals and plants as well. If I haven't said it before, I'm tremendously concerned about the amount of habitat out there for northern pike. If they are present, we hope that we can find them in time for a rapid response action before it becomes too large to control. There is so much more habitat out there compared to locations where pike are established now. I mean, it is the Columbia River downstream and adjacent to the Snake River, so the river's big down there. And obviously all the ESU units of the 13 listed stocks of anadromous fish have to go through these locations. There's a lot of positive ramifications for getting out and doing this work. It facilitated direct collaboration and cooperation with our regional partners, both with our member tribes, federal agencies, and state agencies. We covered a lot of ground last year, and it really gave us a big picture perspective of what's happening on the river. I've worked on the Columbia River since the early 90s, but a lot of that work is out in the main channel, deep water, doing sturgeon work. But going to all these different little side channel and sloughs and backwater locations, it really kind of was eye-opening to see how much change had occurred from the early days of my time on the river. We had a lot of opportunities for outreach with the public while doing our work. People would come up and ask us what we were doing on the back of the truck with all the water jugs and everything. So we were able to reach out and educate people about our work and the importance of not spreading non-native species. And it really established the tribes and CritFix presence on the river as far as much more work on invasive species directly. A lot of the work in the past that I've been doing has been somewhat limited to attending meetings and working on documents to keep the tribes abreast of non-native and invasive species actions and opportunities in the Columbia River. But this was a project that put me directly on the river, as well as staff, Denise and others, to do the work directly and helping our colleagues rather than relying on them for support. And we're out there actively monitoring for northern pike. Our plans for 2024 are we'll be resuming sampling actually in April, not March, but we'll be out there next week, all week, working the Hanford Reach again with our partners from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And these are areas that we really couldn't reach last year because of access. We did not have the airboat wasn't available, or there was not a jet boat available last fall to get up into the reach. And of course, we want to get out there right now before we have the freshet this spring. High runoff water, we can get into sites that might have pike in them right now actually spawning. We want to do a lot more gill netting and high risk locations where pike, if they would become established, they're going to be more likely established closer to Lake Roosevelt than further downstream. And we're going to be increasing our sampling locations this year because we have an earlier start and we can sample during the spring when pike could be spawning. Apologize for not having my email up here, but if anybody wants to get in touch with me directly, they can reach out to Joey. And my name's listed on the materials as well. So any questions? I'm not sure if I have any time left, but appreciate hearing from you. Thank you.